So really quickly, going back to it, this is how risk mitigation on the race course is part of your strategy, right? And if you lower the risk, you lower the reward, or you lower the leverage, you lower the reward. And things like Rich's race last weekend was a prime example. Their OCS in the race, they're already a minute behind, so you're happy to take big risks, like going hard into the right-hand side increases your leverage on the fleet, increases your reward, but it's very high risk. If you're in a situation where you're happy to spend the risk, which Richard was, it obviously paid dividends, but it might not pay dividends every time. So when you look at a start line, I like to think the centre of the start line is the least amount of leverage to each end of the line, so it lowers the risk starting there. And as you can see, as you move towards the ends, the risk increases, the reward increases, but you know, so 5 degrees start line bias at the wrong end, it makes a bigger difference if you're at that end versus the wrong end or the middle. And that applies all across the race course with, you know, how deep into a shift you sail as part of your strategy, things like that. Just quickly, I went through this one with Max yesterday, and this goes back to the start line, the port approach, and I know everyone thinks the port approach is actually a boat on port trying to cross the whole fleet. God's own start, right? This works particularly well for displacement boats, not so well for really lightweight dinghies. You find that the whole fleet, and at whatever time it might be, will rack up like on starboard with potentially a minute, and the slower and bigger they are, the longer they spend racked up. The port approach boat, there's an offence and a defence to it. Previous to the start, you will have sailed the line, time run on the line, so you might, let's say that line's taking you 2 minutes in either direction, so you know it's a 2-minute line. In between that, you've taken compass bearings on the line, you've worked out which end's favoured, which we won't cover. You've taken head to winds, so you work out which way the shifts are going. You've worked out, rightio, I want to start in the middle of the line because that's where I want to be. So a 2-minute line from the pin end to get to the middle of the line is 1 minute. You know it takes, from previous sailing, it takes me about 15 seconds to take my Couta boat, right? So starting from down here with 1:15 and then allow the 30 seconds to get to the line, it's all calculations that you do, and it'll change depending on how much tide's pushing, how much wind's blowing, how many boats are in the fleet. But as soon as you start taking the transom of these boats, it becomes quite apparent where all the customers are lying and where the holes are in the fleet, right? I won't go through them all, but you're choosing your position early as the port tack boat, you've calculated your approach. The turn in's quite critical, and it's something that takes a lot of practice. But once you've picked your gap here between red and blue as the coming in as number 3, it's all in the approach, and it's basically following the shroud of the starboard tack boat as the port tack boat. And you're coming in, you'll find your gap in here. So instead of being stuck out, hung out to dry with a minute to go as a starboard tack boat and getting all this main sheet tangled up, you're actually only on starboard tack for about the last 30 seconds, and you've carried all your speed into that hole. So you're not looking for big accelerations, only small accelerations. There's rules that do apply. Things like you see quite often in match racing, because it's part of a dial-up in a match race, is the port tack boat actually never completes its tack and goes straight into luffing the starboard tack boat. So it's really important that you complete the tack and then come back to head to wind to control the gap. Golden rule for starting is you always want to start there with the biggest gap to leeward you possibly can. And it makes it quite easy because you actually come in with more speed than the starboard tack boat to control that gap, initially giving them room to keep clear.
We've got a boat here like this. It's on port tack. Goes through head to wind, a little bit past head to wind. What tack is it on now?
Still on port tack.
Still on port tack.
It's so the wind's coming here, so it's now on starboard. But Rule 13 says that whilst a boat is tacking, it's keep clear of the world. So when are you no longer tacking? You're no longer tacking when you get on a close hauled course. It doesn't matter whether you've sheeted in your sails, it's the heading of the boat, 45 degrees on a Couta boat. You've got to get down to that 45 close hauled course before you become starboard boat. And then when you do that, obviously if you've acquired right of way as starboard, if you're going to try and call starboard on a port tack boat, which might be here, you need to initially give it room to keep clear. And in this scenario, if you just completed your tack like that, have you initially given that boat room? No. Sorry, Adam.
No, that's all right. Well, but the idea of this is it's quite low risk because you know your time into where you want to be. It's the execution of the turn that's key, and it's really worth. There's some good videos, and we can put the links up to it. Actually, executing this turn is the key to making it all happen. As much as there's an offer, the port boat's the offence there, and what you tend to find is the starboard tack's actually limited because it is the right-of-way boat, so it's got all these obligations on what it needs to do to allow the port boat to keep clear of it. There are defences against it, and I'll really briefly, really the only way to defend against a port approach start like that is you've got to get your bow down early, try and block the hole, force the port boat to tack early, so that hopefully you end up back in that position where you've got the leeward gap. It's all about maintaining your leeward gap, getting as big a leeward gap as you can, because 2 minutes after the start you've got, we won't cover it now, but you've got your different modes. You've got a high mode and a low mode, say, and your VMG mode. You're able to execute either of those modes to make your strategy work. If your strategy is to go left, you need to hold this lane, and having a big leeward gap is going to let you hold that lane for as long as you can. Really quickly, just one thing I see all the time with the Couta boats is they come around the top mark with the mainsail pinned and the jib off, and they go around the bottom mark with the jib pinned and the mainsail off. And this is where you really need to get on top of it. That to turn the boat, you use your sails. To bear away, you need to jib on, main off, and to bring the boat up, you main on, jib off, right? Because the boat will turn without a lot less rudder movement. The best way to defend this hole is jib on, main off, get your bow down without actually going forwards, and then main on, jib off. And it won't happen, but ideally you're turning on the spot to maintain that hole. And it's all boat control, you know, and it goes back to Ben's situation before where the boat comes in here, main on, jib off is actually going to help keep it clear, turns you tighter, and what it does is this boat now needs to sail a lot further around you than you just accelerating. Stuck to the board. If two boats accelerate and do a turn like that, the outside boat will always maintain its position forward, bow to bow with you. If you can turn your boat on a spot like that, the outside boat has to travel a lot quicker to get around that curve, and that applies at bottom mark roundings, top mark roundings, start lines, everywhere. It all goes back to boat setup, boat handling.
We've got port and starboard on the first beat. We're going like this. In this scenario, it's 5 knots of breeze and just clears by a metre. Starboard port gets across. Starboard hasn't had to change course. 5 knots of breeze, 2 metres of clearance. In those conditions, are you worried that you're about to do a bow spread? Not really. No. So in that scenario, it was close, but they got away with it. Let's crank the breeze up and just move down to Sandringham, where we've got 2.5 metre seas in 22 knots of breeze. Everyone is travelling at pace. It's all on. From here, and you're going over the 2 metre seas. Everything is going up and down. You're looking at this as helmsman, and there's going to be 2 metres. Oh, sorry. It looks like you're going to hit. You say, they're not going to cross, they're not going to cross. And it's genuine. You're not making this up. It's genuine. You have a reasonable apprehension of a collision. And you duck to avoid. It later turns out, because people had GPSs, that there was a 2 metre clearance. There's a case that it's called case 50 for port and starboard. It says if the right-of-way boat has a reasonable apprehension of collision, then the port tack boat has breached. The point there is that what's reasonable change and how much room you need to give changes according to the conditions. So I'm sure you've all gone within, you know, this much of other boats, which is scary enough in itself. In 5 knots, you know, you kind of think that's cool and I'll live with it. But in 20 knots and seas, that's just crazy. It's such a high risk. It's toss of the coin as to whether or not you get away with it. There is always, backing that up, there's always the obligation to avoid contact. So the right-of-way boat doesn't need to, if reasonably possible, does not need to change course to avoid contact unless, until it's clear that the other boat is not keeping clear, until they know that the other boat is not keeping clear. And they'll get exonerated, so they'll break the rule if there's a little bit, you know, they start to luff and there's a little bit of contact, you know, so sail on side stay. Unless there's damage. So as soon as anything gets broken, then nothing exonerates right of way. As soon as there is damage or injury, a right of way boat that has not avoided contact has also broken the rule and never gets exonerated.
Just a comment, particularly on the Couta boats, but if the port tack boat thinks it's going to be close, it's always a good idea to look at the starboard crew and see if they're actually watching and seeing you approach.
Communication. Okay. So one of the things, we're just waiting on the word from World Sailing. There are things called, I've just talked about case 50. There's a case that was put up to the annual conference. We don't know the result of it, but they're proposing that in this case, that the port boat can call out, do I need to tack or can I cross? So this boat,
In other words, it's giving the onus to the blue boat.
yeah, well the blue boat's in control, it's got all the
Yeah, but
rights.
the red boat's going to tell, I need to tag.
No, going to ask. Gives the port boat an opportunity to ask, and if the port boat gets permission, because this boat wants to go across there, and this boat, you know, even before it was asked, and you got crew under the main saying go through because I want to be across this side.
Yeah. And the reason it happens is because a port and starboard cross is a sliding scale, right? Get the colours right. So there's a port starboard cross where the collision's going to be there, right? Sliding all the way through to where the port starboard collision's going to end there. As the starboard tack boat and executing your strategy, right? If it's going to be a collision there, there's no way known I would call starboard on the port tack yacht because the tack's either going to end up there in a lee bow, right? Or they're going to manage to get across you and end up there, or they're going to completely chicken wing it and end up right in front of you, right? If they're going to hit you there, they're not going to affect your strategy at all, which just really quickly, we can place other boats strategically, right? If you're, don't worry about the colours for this one, just really quick, going back to risk mitigation and leverage, if you place a boat there, the opposition, these boats are all the same boats, think. If you take the distance it sails that boat with the tacks, they end up quite close to you, right? Putting them directly downwind. If you put a boat out the back or out the side, if you get a left-hand shift here, it's very low risk on this boat, but the reward for the shift is really low, right? So you reduce your leverage. If you put a boat in this position or anywhere forward of here, because as they go forward, they get further out, you go left, the gain's really big, right? But the risk is really big, because as soon as you get a header, the same thing, your loss is bigger than if you put them in that situation. So the cross, letting a boat cross or not, it all comes back to how much risk you're willing to give that boat. And this could be that you owe this boat 2 minutes, and at the last mark you timed them 3 minutes behind you. So all you want to do is consolidate. You don't need to gain anymore, so there's no point putting them into a high risk situation.